It was a quiet, somber Thursday evening when the strange events began unfolding, a day I'll never forget. My neighbor's dog, Max, had always been a comforting presence in our small suburban neighborhood. His playful barks and wagging tail could brighten even the dreariest day. Yet, as I stood in my yard that evening, watering my roses under the dim glow of the street lamp, I realized I hadn't heard Max in hours. The nights seemed heavier, the silence oppressive. I brushed it off as my imagination. Dogs wander. But by morning, my casual concern transformed into something far darker. As I knelt in the soft earth, tending to my flowers, I unearthed something chilling. Max's collar, half buried beneath the soil. The leather strap, familiar and worn from years of use, was smeared with fresh dirt. It wasn't just that the collar was there, it was how it was buried. The earth around it was compacted, deliberate. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free, the small metal tag with Max's name catching the morning sunlight. My stomach churned. Something was deeply wrong. When my neighbor returned home later that day, I rushed to tell them about the collar. Their face turned pale, their hands visibly shaking. "He never takes this off," they murmured, their voice laced with dread. The quiet that settled between us was suffocating, an unspoken understanding passing between us that Max wasn't just lost. Something had taken him. Determined to uncover the truth, we began our search, combing through the woods behind our homes. The deeper we ventured, the more unnatural the air became. The trees, normally alive with the chirping of birds and the rustle of squirrels, stood deathly still. It was as though we had entered another world, one cloaked in shadow and unease. Then, we found it, a clearing deep within the woods, the ground unnaturally barren, as though life itself had been sucked from it. In the center stood a grotesque effigy, fashioned crudely from sticks and animal bones. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer. Around its base were scraps of fur, disturbingly golden. From that day forward, the world I knew began unraveling. At night, my dreams were plagued by twisted visions of shadowy figures standing at the edge of my yard, their forms indistinct, but their intent unmistakably sinister. Scratches appeared on my windows, though I never saw what caused them. And then there were the whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When my neighbor vanished without a trace a week later, the fear that had been simmering inside me boiled over. The police were called, their investigations fruitless. People don't just disappear, I told myself, yet the gnawing dread in my chest suggested otherwise. Days turned into weeks. My once vibrant neighborhood was now a ghost town. People began moving away, their departures hurried and panicked. Each night, I locked my doors and windows, but no amount of security could keep the nightmares at bay. One evening, as I sat in my living room, the flickering light of the television my only company, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a dog. No, it was deeper, more primal. My heart raced as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy fireplace poker, and crept toward the sound. The growl grew louder as I approached the back door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting against my skin. I flung the door open, expecting to see an intruder, or perhaps some wild animal. But the yard was empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon. Then I saw it, Max's collar, hanging from the lowest branch of the oak tree in my yard, swaying gently as though mocking me. A deep, resonant laugh echoed through the night, though no one was there. My knees buckled as a wave of nausea washed over me. I was no longer safe. None of us were. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. I began noticing scratches on my skin, marks that hadn't been there the night before. My plants withered, the vibrant greens turning to lifeless browns. And then came the symbols, carved into the wooden beams of my porch, etched into the glass of my windows. They were crude, primitive, and radiated an energy that made my skin crawl. Desperation drove me to the old library on the edge of town, its dusty shelves holding tomes long forgotten. I pored over books on local folklore, desperate for answers. What I found chilled me to the bone. The woods behind my home were once the site of ritualistic ceremonies led by a secretive cult that worshipped an ancient, malevolent entity. Their offerings? Living sacrifices. Dogs, cats, and sometimes people. My resolve hardened as the truth came into focus. This wasn't just about Max.
It wasn't even about me.
Something had awakened, and it demanded more. Armed with the knowledge I had gleaned, I ventured into the woods one last time, the weight of dread pressing heavily on my chest. In my hands, I carried a bundle of herbs and salt, symbols of protection from the old books. I retraced my steps to the clearing, the effigy now replaced by a gaping hole in the earth from which a foul stench emanated. The whispers returned, louder now, each word clawing at the edges of my sanity. The ground beneath me trembled, and from the shadows emerged a figure, a grotesque amalgamation of fur, bone, and shadow, its hollow eyes burning with malevolence. This was no longer about finding answers. It was about survival. What happened next, I can scarcely describe. It was as though the forest came alive, the trees themselves conspiring to trap me. My only thought was escape, but as I ran, the whispers followed, growing louder and more insistent. When I finally stumbled out of the woods and into the pale light of dawn, I collapsed, my body shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I survived that night, and I don't know what became of the entity in the woods. But even now, as I write this, I can feel its gaze upon me, its hunger lingering like a shadow over my life. I never saw Max again, nor my neighbor. And though the woods remain, I avoid them, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. That evening, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, clutching the third note in my trembling hands, an overwhelming sense of paranoia settled over me. The thought that someone had been following my every move was suffocating. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in, and every shadow seemed alive with sinister intent. I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains tight, but the sense of being watched never left. I tried to convince myself that this could still be some elaborate prank, a friend or coworker testing my patience or trying to scare me. But no matter how much I rationalized, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that this was something far more dangerous. There was a precision to the notes, a meticulousness that suggested whoever was behind them had a purpose, one I couldn't yet decipher. The fourth note. The next morning, I woke up to find a fourth note, this time slid under my front door. My blood ran cold as I picked it up, the pristine white paper a stark contrast to the dark wood of the floor. The handwriting was the same, neat, deliberate, almost unnaturally precise. I see you. You can't hide. Last night, you locked the windows and checked them twice. But I was already inside. I staggered backward, the words blurring as panic surged through me. Inside? My apartment? I scanned the room frantically, my mind racing as I tried to remember if I had noticed anything out of place. Had I forgotten to lock a door? Was there a way and I hadn't considered? The thought that a stranger had been here, watching me as I slept, was unbearable. I called the police, desperate for some semblance of security, but their response was underwhelming. The officer on the phone listened patiently as I explained the situation, but dismissed it as likely a harmless prank. They promised to send someone to check in later, but suggested I install a security camera for peace of mind. The shadows move. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent shivers down my spine. I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, my eyes darting toward the shadows that seemed to grow longer as the hours stretched on. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of unseen eyes. Around 3 a.m., as I was finally beginning to nod off, a sound jolted me awake. It was faint, but distinct, the soft scrape of metal against metal. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear it again, the knife trembling in my hand. It came from a hallway near the front door. Summoning all my courage, I crept toward the door, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The sound grew louder as I approached, and when I peered through the peephole, my stomach lurched. There was no one there, but the chain on the door was swinging slowly, as though it had just been touched. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps, and then I saw it. Another note, taped to the inside of the door this time. My hands shook as I peeled it off, the words on the paper sending a fresh wave of terror through me.
You almost caught me.
Maybe next time. Descent into madness. Days turned into weeks, and the notes kept coming, each more invasive and unsettling than the last. They began appearing in places that defied explanation. Inside my locked car, in the bathroom mirror, scrawled in condensation after a shower, even tucked into the pages of a book I hadn't opened in months. The police grew increasingly dismissive of my pleas for help. They found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence that anyone had been in my apartment but me. Friends and family began to pull away, their concern turning to skepticism as I recounted the bizarre occurrences. Some suggested I was imagining things, that stress or lack of sleep was making me paranoid. But I knew the truth. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and they were getting closer. The stranger in the window. One night, as I sat at my desk trying to distract myself with work, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and an inexplicable dread settled over me. I glanced toward the window and froze. There, just beyond the glass, was a face. Pale, gaunt, and expressionless, it stared at me with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty to be human. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, rooting me to the spot. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint outline of its breath on the glass. I bolted to the door, knife in hand, but when I flung it open, there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbance in the hallway. I was alone, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. The final revelation. As the days wore on, I became consumed by the mystery. I installed cameras, changed locks, even moved to a new apartment, but the notes followed me. Whoever, or whatever, was behind them seemed to know my every move, as if they were always one step ahead. It wasn't until I discovered an old photograph tucked into one of the notes that I began to piece together the horrifying truth. The photo was faded, its edges worn, but the image was unmistakable. It was me as a child, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. And behind me, barely visible in the shadows, was the same pale figure I had seen outside my window. My hands shook as I turned the photo over, revealing a message scrawled in the same familiar handwriting. "I've been watching you your whole life. And now, it's time." I dropped the photo, my mind reeling. How could this be possible? Who, or what, was this figure, and why had it been following me? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear. There was no escaping it. The note stopped after that, but the silence was far more unsettling. Every shadow, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, felt like a reminder that it was still out there, waiting. And as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me even now, its dark eyes fixed on the words spilling onto the page. Maybe this is its way of letting me know that no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I'll never be alone. And neither will you. The days after the photograph felt like walking through a waking nightmare. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, pale and lifeless, its dark, hollow eyes staring at me as if peeling away layers of my mind, exposing every fear I'd ever buried. I couldn't escape the sensation that it was near, always near. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was reality, mine at least. Moving didn't help. Changing my locks, installing more cameras, even switching jobs to keep my daily routine unpredictable didn't matter. Wherever I went, it followed, leaving its chilling trail of notes as a reminder that there was no hiding. I spent hours poring over that photograph, my fingers tracing the edges of the ghostly figure lurking behind my younger self. I didn't recognize the house or the street it was taken on. My parents, The only people who could have explained the picture had passed years ago, and I never thought to ask about places we'd lived or visited when I was small. It wasn't something that had seemed important until now. The photo felt heavier every time I looked at it, as if the paper itself carried some dark energy. I turned it over countless times, reading and rereading the message scrawled in that same, precise handwriting. I've been watching you your whole life. And now it's time. What did it mean? Time for what? In my desperation for answers, I turned to the internet, diving into forums for unexplained phenomena and stalking the darkest corners of the web for similar stories. I found countless tales of hauntings, stalkers, shadowy figures that followed people, but none of them matched what I was experiencing. Those stories had beginnings and endings, even if tragic ones. Mine felt endless, as if I were spiraling into a void with no bottom. The few people I confided in grew increasingly distant. Some offered weak platitudes about seeking therapy, and others simply avoided me altogether. I couldn't blame them. I sounded insane, even to myself. One night, as the weight of it all threatened to crush me, I sat alone in my apartment, a bottle of whiskey on the table and the photograph beside it. The room was dark except for the glow of a single lamp. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred, trying to will the figure into revealing itself, to give me something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping, like fingernails against glass. My blood turned to ice as I turned toward the sound. The window. It was coming from the window. Slowly, as if in a dream, I stood and walked toward it, my legs trembling with each step. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, and the closer I got, the more I felt that cold, suffocating presence I'd come to associate with it. When I finally reached the window, I hesitated, my hand hovering inches from the curtain. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it could hear me. Summoning what little courage I had left, I yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. The street below was empty, bathed in the eerie orange glow of a flickering street lamp. I pressed my forehead against the glass, exhaling in shaky relief. But that relief was short-lived. When I turned back to the room, there it was. The figure stood in the corner, its pale form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room like a storm cloud, oppressive and unyielding. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could do was stare, my body frozen in terror. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, I stepped toward it. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, but it said nothing. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, and I hated the way it made me sound. Weak, desperate. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a breeze. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of cold in the air where it had stood. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't a person. It couldn't be. No human could move like that, disappear like that. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the rules of our world. The next morning, I found another note, this one placed neatly on my pillow. It was different from the others, shorter, almost cryptic. "You're getting closer." Closer to what? I wanted to scream, to tear the paper to shreds, but I knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't something I could fight or escape. The only way forward was to confront it, to follow the breadcrumbs it had left, and hope they led to answers instead of madness. Over the next few weeks, the notes became less frequent, but their messages grew more pointed. "Remember the house. Go back to where it began. The truth is waiting." The photograph haunted me, its every detail burned into my memory. I became obsessed with finding the house, convinced it held the key to understanding everything. I scoured old family photo albums, searched through records, even reached out to distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Finally, after weeks of digging, I found it. It was a small, unassuming house in a quiet, rural town several hours' drive away. My parents had lived there briefly when I was a toddler, though none of my relatives could tell me much about it. The house had been sold decades ago and had changed hands several times since then. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to suggest why it might be connected to the nightmare that had consumed my life. But I knew I had to go. The drive to the house was long and uneventful, the monotonous stretch of highway giving me too much time to think. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting the house in an otherworldly glow. It looked almost exactly as it had in the photograph, though the years had worn it down. The paint was peeling, the windows streaked with grime, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I parked on the side of the road and sat there for a long moment, staring at the house and trying to summon the courage to step inside. Finally, as the last light of day faded, I made my way to the front door. It was unlocked, the wood creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through the room slowly, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The furniture was sparse, and what little remained was covered in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts. Nothing about the house seemed unusual, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I made my way to the living room, where the photograph had been taken, and froze. There, standing in the exact spot I'd been in all those years ago, was the figure. It was clearer now, more defined, its features sharper and more human-like but still wrong. Its eyes were as dark and empty as ever, and its lips curled into a chilling semblance of a smile. "You came," it said, its voice low and hollow, like wind through a tunnel. "I've been waiting." My mouth went dry, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "What do you want?" I finally managed, my voice trembling. It tilted its head again, that same curious gesture that sent shivers down my spine. "The truth," it said simply. And then the world shifted. The walls of the house seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling void of darkness. The figure stepped closer, its form growing larger, more imposing, until it towered over me. Images flashed before my eyes. Memories I didn't recognize, faces I didn't know, places I'd never been. The truth it spoke of wasn't something I could understand, not in the way I wanted to. It was vast, incomprehensible, like staring into the abyss and realizing it was staring back. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the house, the photograph clutched tightly in my hand. The figure was gone, and the house was silent once more. But something had changed. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but I knew I wasn't the same. The world wasn't the same. I left the house that night, but its shadow followed me, just as the figure had. The notes stopped, but the memories remained, haunting me in ways I couldn't escape. I'd found the truth it had spoken of, but it wasn't a comfort. It was a curse, one I'd carry for the rest of my life. And as I sit here, writing this, I can feel it watching me again, its dark eyes peering through the cracks in the walls of reality, waiting for the moment it decides to return. The days after leaving the house were a haze of dread and disconnection. I told myself I had escaped, that I had faced whatever it was and walked away with my life intact, but that was a lie. The figure, the house, the photograph, they weren't gone. They were with me now, stitched into the fabric of my existence, like a scar I couldn't erase. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that void, surrounded by the swirling memories and fragmented truths it had forced into my mind. They played on an endless loop, a reel of haunting images that refused to fade. Faces I didn't know, voices I didn't recognize, all whispering. I tried to return to my normal life, but normal was a concept that no longer applied. Work felt like a distant dream, a place where people shuffled papers and held meaningless conversations while I sat at my desk, my mind elsewhere. My coworkers noticed the change in me, their concerned glances lingering just a little too long. One day, my manager called me into her office, her voice soft but firm as she suggested I take some time off. I didn't argue. I didn't care. The truth was, I didn't know what to do anymore. The world felt thin, as if I could reach out and tear it open, revealing the darkness that had seeped into my life. I started spending my days walking aimlessly through the city, hoping the noise and chaos of the streets would drown out the quiet terror inside me. It didn't help. The figure was always there, not in a physical sense, but in the corners of my mind, a constant presence that whispered to me in ways I couldn't understand. I'd see shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, hear faint tapping sounds that echoed through the silence of my apartment. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, the lingering effects of what I'd been through. But the more it happened, the more I realized it was real. It hadn't left me. It never would. One night, as I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that prickled my skin, but it grew stronger, heavier, until I felt as though I was being suffocated. I sat up, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The figure stood at the foot of the couch, its dark eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the room, tangible and overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so profound it rooted me to the spot. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, and for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was low and hollow, echoing as if it came from a great distance. "You already know." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't understand. Please, just tell me what you want." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling like smoke until it was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of cold in the air. I sat there for hours, unable to move, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. The next morning, I found another note. It was on the kitchen table, written in the same precise handwriting as the others. "The truth is inside you." I stared at the words, my hands trembling, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of anger. What truth? What was this thing trying to tell me? I was tired of being its pawn, of living in fear. If it wanted me to find the truth, then I would. I didn't care what it cost. I started researching again, diving deeper into the strange and unexplained. I read about hauntings, possessions, entities that attached themselves to people and refused to let go.
None of it felt right.
This wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was something else, something older, something beyond my understanding. I found myself drawn to stories of people who claimed to have encountered similar phenomena, but their accounts were fragmented, disjointed, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. As the days turned into weeks, I became consumed by my search. My apartment turned into a chaotic mess of books, notes, and photographs, all connected by a web of string and pins that spread across the walls. I barely ate, barely slept, my every waking moment devoted to finding answers. The figure appeared less frequently, but its presence was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. One night, as I pored over an old journal I'd found in a dusty corner of an obscure bookstore, something clicked. The journal belonged to a man who had lived over a century ago, a recluse who claimed to have encountered a being that defied explanation. His descriptions matched mine almost exactly. The pale figure, the dark eyes, the sense of being watched. He wrote about how it had followed him, haunted him, until he uncovered what it wanted. A memory, buried deep within him, something he had forgotten but that the figure needed him to remember. The man's final entry was chilling. "The truth is not a gift," he wrote. "It is a burden. And once you carry it, you can never put it down." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I closed the journal. Was that what the figure wanted? A memory? Something I had forgotten? I tried to think back, to piece together my childhood, but my memories were hazy, fragmented. My parents had been kind but distant, their lives consumed by work. We had moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for me to form any real connections. It was a lonely childhood, but nothing about it seemed unusual, nothing that would explain why this thing had attached itself to me. Desperate for answers, I decided to return to the house one last time. It was a risk, I knew that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the key to everything lay within those crumbling walls. The drive there felt longer this time, the road stretching out endlessly before me. When I finally arrived, the house loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I stepped inside, the air heavy with that same suffocating presence. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it, waiting for me. I made my way to the living room, the photograph clutched tightly in my hand. As I stood in the center of the room, I spoke aloud, my voice steady despite the fear that churned inside me. "I'm here. Show me." The air shifted, the walls trembling as the void began to take shape around me once more. The figure appeared, its form more solid than ever, and this time, it spoke without hesitation. "You must remember, I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted, my voice echoing in the emptiness. The figure stepped closer, its dark eyes locking onto mine. "You will." And then it touched me. Its hand was cold, impossibly cold, and the moment it made contact, my mind exploded with images. Memories I didn't know I had flooded back, overwhelming me with their intensity. I saw myself as a child, standing in that very room, my parents arguing in the background. I saw a door, hidden behind a bookshelf, and the fear in my mother's eyes as she pulled me away from it. I saw the figure, watching from the shadows even then, its presence unnoticed but always there. When the memory stopped, I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The figure stood over me, silent, waiting. Slowly, I got to my feet and made my way to the bookshelf, my hands trembling as I pushed it aside. There, hidden in the wall, was the door for my memories. It was old and weathered, its surface marked with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to know what lay beyond. But I had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. What I saw on the other side would haunt me for the rest of my life. When I pulled open the door, a wave of cold air hit me, sharp and biting like winter's breath. Beyond the threshold was not another room, not a basement, not a hidden crawl space. It was something else entirely. The space was infinite and suffocating all at once, a void so deep that it seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself. The ground beneath me gave way to a dim, pulsating light that stretched far beyond what my eyes could see. It wasn't empty, though. Shapes moved within it, indistinct and writhing, their forms shifting and melding like shadows given life. My first instinct was to close the door and run, to pretend I hadn't seen this, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place by a force I couldn't understand. I stepped inside, my movements slow and deliberate, as if every inch forward required an act of sheer will. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on me with the weight of countless unseen eyes. The symbols etched into the doorframe began to glow as I passed through, their light seeping into my skin, filling me with a strange warmth that warred against the cold around me. It felt like stepping into a memory, one that wasn't my own but was somehow deeply familiar. Each step brought a new sensation, whispers brushing against my ears, the faint hum of something alive and ancient vibrating in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but the space seemed to guide me, the light beneath my feet growing brighter with each step. The shapes in the void began to take form, their outlines sharpening into figures that stood silently, watching. They were tall and impossibly thin, their bodies covered in the same glowing symbols as the door. Their faces were blank, featureless, but their presence was overwhelming, a mix of curiosity and judgment that pierced through me like a blade. I wanted to speak, to ask them who they were, what they wanted, but my voice refused to work. Instead, I kept walking, their silent stares burning into my back. The path led me to a structure that seemed to rise out of the void itself, a towering monolith of black stone that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. Its surface was smooth, almost liquid, and the symbols carved into it shifted and changed as I approached. At its base was an opening, a doorway framed by a swirling energy that shimmered like water in sunlight. The closer I got, the more I felt the pull, a force that wasn't physical but emotional, drawing me in with a strange mix of fear and longing. It was as if this place, this moment, had been waiting for me all along. When I stepped through the doorway, the world shifted again. The void was gone, replaced by a room that was achingly familiar. It was the living room from my childhood, every detail painstakingly accurate, down to the faded pattern on the rug and the faint smell of my mother's perfume lingering in the air. But it wasn't just a memory. It was alive, vibrant, as if I had truly stepped back in time. My parents were there, sitting on the couch, their faces etched with worry as they whispered to each other. They didn't seem to notice me, their voices too soft for me to make out the words. I stood there, frozen, as the scene unfolded before me. My younger self ran into the room, clutching a drawing in his tiny hands. "Look, Mommy. Look what I made," he said, his voice high and full of excitement. My mother looked up, her expression softening as she took the drawing. But my father didn't smile. His face grew darker, his gaze shifting toward the bookshelf. He stood abruptly, moving toward it with a sense of urgency that made my heart race. My mother tried to stop him, her voice sharp and pleading, but he ignored her, pulling the bookshelf aside to reveal the hidden door. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "Not now. He's too young." My father didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped through, disappearing into the void. My mother turned to me, no, to the younger me, her eyes filled with tears. "You must never go in there," she said, her voice trembling. "Promise me." The scene dissolved, melting away like a dream, and I was back in the void. The figures surrounded me now, their blank faces turned toward me as if waiting for something. The light beneath me shifted, forming a new path that led deeper into the darkness. I followed it, my mind racing with questions I couldn't begin to answer. The path ended at another door, smaller and simpler than the first. This one was made of wood, its surface worn and splintered, as if it had been there for centuries. I reached for the handle, hesitating for only a moment before pushing it open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, its walls covered in the same shifting symbols as the monolith. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat an object that seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was the photograph, the same one I had found in the house, but now it was whole, complete. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The moment I touched it, the symbols on the walls flared to life, their light flooding the room and filling my mind with images. Memories, not just mine, but countless others, all intertwined in a tapestry of pain and loss and longing. I saw my father standing in this very room, his face etched with the same fear I felt now. I saw him place the photograph on the pedestal, his hands shaking as he whispered words I couldn't understand. And then I saw the figure, emerging from the shadows, its dark eyes fixed on him as it reached out and touched his shoulder. The vision faded, and I was left alone in the room, the photograph still clutched in my hands. I understood now.
This wasn't just about me.
It was about all of us, my family, the people who had come before, the ones who had been drawn to this place and left forever changed. The figure wasn't an enemy. It was a guide, a guardian of truths too heavy for most to bear. I stepped back through the doorway, the photograph held tightly against my chest. The figures in the void watched me as I passed, their silent stares no longer filled with judgment, but with something that felt almost like approval. When I reached the monolith, I placed the photograph on its surface. The symbols flared once more, and the void began to dissolve, the light consuming everything until there was nothing left. I woke up on the floor of the house, the morning sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The photograph was gone, and the door behind the bookshelf was closed, its surface smooth and unmarked, as if it had never been there. The figure was gone too, its presence no longer lingering at the edges of my mind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt at peace. I left the house without looking back, the weight of the truth settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I would never be the same. The figure had shown me what I needed to see, had guided me to a truth I hadn't even known I was searching for. And though it had left me, I knew it would always be with me, a silent reminder of the path I had walked and the price I had paid to find it. Leaving the house felt like emerging from a dense fog, where every breath I took carried both relief and unease. The world outside seemed brighter, sharper, almost unnaturally vivid, as if my senses had been heightened by everything I had experienced. The birds sang louder, the rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like whispers, and even the sunlight felt heavier on my skin. I got into my car, the engines hum grounding me in a way I desperately needed. I didn't look back, not even once, but the pull of the house lingered. It wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a part of me, woven into my thoughts and feelings, like a shadow that would never fade. As I drove away, the road stretched endlessly before me, winding through empty fields and dense woods, a perfect reflection of the emptiness I felt inside. I kept replaying everything in my mind, the figures, the monolith, the photograph, and the strange truths I had uncovered. What had the house really been? Was it a portal, a test, or some kind of ancient anomaly that drew in people like me, desperate for answers they didn't know they were seeking? It wasn't fear that gripped me now, but a gnawing curiosity, a hunger to understand what it all meant. Yet, deep down, I knew the answers weren't something I could simply uncover. They were locked away in a place I might never reach again. The drive back to my ordinary life felt surreal. The world around me seemed unchanged, oblivious to the monumental shift I had experienced. Cars passed by, their drivers lost in their own mundane routines, and I wondered if they too carried secrets, burdens hidden beneath their unremarkable exteriors. When I finally reached home, my small apartment felt foreign, almost lifeless, as if it belonged to someone else. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. Days turned into weeks, and the events at the house became a constant undercurrent in my thoughts. I returned to my job, tried to rekindle old friendships, and immerse myself in the normalcy of daily life, but everything felt hollow. I began noticing patterns in the world around me, connections I had never seen before. The way the wind carried whispers through the trees, the subtle changes in people's expressions when they thought no one was watching, even the rhythm of footsteps on the pavement. All of it felt deliberate, as if some unseen force was weaving a story that I was now part of. One evening, as I sifted through old family belongings, hoping to find some thread that might lead me back to the truths I had glimpsed, I came across a journal. It wasn't mine, nor did it belong to anyone I recognized. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, and its pages were filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. The entries described experiences eerily similar to mine, visions, figures, and a house that seemed alive. Each page resonated with a strange familiarity, as if the author had walked the same path I had. The journal became an obsession. I spent hours poring over its pages, piecing together the fragments of its story. The author spoke of a journey, not just through the house, but beyond, into a realm where time and space dissolved, leaving only raw, unfiltered existence. They described the figures as both guides and guardians, beings that protected the truths hidden within the void. There were warnings too, cryptic messages about the dangers of seeking too much, of pushing beyond the limits of human understanding. The final entries were unsettling. The author wrote of a decision, a choice to embrace the unknown fully or to return to the ordinary world, forever marked by what they had seen. They chose the former, and the journal ended abruptly, the last page torn as if the act of writing it had been too much to bear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal had found its way to me for a reason, that the author's journey was now entwined with my own. I began dreaming of the house again, but these dreams were different. They weren't nightmares, but vivid, almost comforting visions. I saw the monolith, its symbols glowing with a warmth that felt welcoming. The figures were there too, their blank faces turned toward me, their silent presence no longer intimidating but almost reassuring. Each dream ended the same way, with a photograph, whole and complete, resting in my hands. I would wake up with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by a mix of longing and understanding that I couldn't put into words. The pull of the house grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a call, a whisper at the edge of my mind that refused to be ignored. I knew I couldn't resist it forever. I began preparing for a return, gathering supplies, researching symbols, and studying every detail of the journal. I didn't tell anyone where I was going or why. This was a journey I had to take alone. When I finally returned to the house, it was as if no time had passed. The air around it was still and heavy, the same oppressive quiet that had greeted me the first time. The door was open, waiting for me, and as I stepped inside, the world shifted once more. The void welcomed me back, its pulsating light brighter than before, and the figures were there, their presence both familiar and new. They surrounded me, their silent stares filled with something I couldn't quite name. Expectation, perhaps, or understanding. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked toward the monolith, the photograph already in my hands. The symbols on its surface flared to life as I approached, their light weaving around me in intricate patterns. The monolith began to change, its smooth surface dissolving to reveal a doorway, and beyond it, a world unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was infinite and boundless, a landscape of light and shadow where everything seemed alive, pulsing with an energy that resonated deep within me. I stepped through, leaving the ordinary world behind, and the figures followed, their presence a constant reminder that I was no longer alone. This was a new beginning, a journey into the unknown where the truths I sought would reveal themselves not in answers, but in experiences, in moments of clarity and connection that defied understanding. As I walked, the photograph dissolved in my hands, its image imprinted in my mind forever, a symbol of the path that had brought me here. The journey was endless, but it wasn't lonely. The figures became companions, their silent presence a source of comfort and guidance. Together, we explored the vastness of the void, uncovering its secrets one by one, each discovery a reminder that the search for truth is not about finding answers, but about embracing the mystery, about finding beauty in the unknown. The house, the monolith, the figures, they were all part of something greater, a story that stretched beyond time and space, a story that I was now a part of forever. The landscape around me shimmered as I ventured deeper into this otherworldly space. The ground beneath my feet was soft, like walking on clouds, but the texture seemed to shift with every step. I couldn't quite put my finger on what was happening around me, but it felt as if time itself was slipping away, as if I had entered a place where the rules of the world I once knew no longer applied. The air, too, was different, cool but electric, humming with an energy I couldn't comprehend. I breathed it in, filling my lungs with something that seemed to clear my mind, to strip away the weight of doubt and fear I had carried with me for so long. The figures around me, those silent beings who had followed me through the portal, moved with purpose but without haste. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as if they were as familiar with the space as I was now becoming. They seemed to communicate without words, their movements graceful and fluid, as if we were all part of some grand choreography. I didn't know what they were or why they were here, but I had the distinct sense that they had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment to arrive. The house, the monolith, the photograph, each had brought me to this point, but it was something more, something beyond my understanding, that now bound me to them. As I walked, I noticed the space around me was constantly shifting, transforming into landscapes I had never seen before. One moment, I was walking through a dense forest, the trees towering above me, their leaves swirling in an unseen wind. The next, the ground beneath me morphed into an ocean, the water stretching out infinitely in every direction. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending, reshaping itself to reflect something deeper, something that lay just beyond the grasp of my consciousness. I reached out to touch the water, and as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a sudden surge of energy, like a pulse that traveled through my entire being. The figures paused as if they were waiting for something, and I felt an overwhelming sense of connection to them. They were more than just guides. They were part of me, and I was part of them. We were bound by something ancient, something that transcended time and space. The moment I made contact with the water, I felt a sudden flash of memories, fragments of lives I had never lived, of worlds I had never seen. Images flashed in my mind like a reel of film spinning too fast to process, but one thing was clear: I was not alone in this space. It was then that I saw the first glimpse of what lay beyond the horizon. A massive structure rose from the ground, towering high into the sky, its surface shimmering with the same light that pulsed around me. It wasn't made of any material I recognized, but it felt familiar, like it had always been here, waiting for someone to arrive. The figures began to move toward it, and I instinctively followed, my steps matching their rhythm as if we were all part of some predetermined journey. As we approached the structure, I felt a sense of awe and reverence wash over me. It was not just a building, it was a monument, a symbol of something far greater than I could comprehend. The closer I got, the more I realized that it wasn't just a structure in the physical sense. It was alive, breathing in sync with the pulse of the space around us. The surface of the building rippled, like a vast ocean, reflecting the shifting light of this strange world. The figures continued to move forward, and I followed, drawn by the same force that had brought me here. We entered the structure, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt a sudden change in the air. It was as if the very atmosphere inside the building was charged with a different energy, one that resonated deep within my soul. The figures moved with purpose, guiding me deeper into the heart of the structure, where the walls seemed to fade away, replaced by an endless expanse of light. It wasn't blinding, but it was all-encompassing, wrapping around me like a soft embrace. In the center of this space stood a figure. It was unlike the others, standing taller, its form more defined. It radiated an energy that was both soothing and overwhelming, as if it embodied everything this place represented. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. The figure looked at me, its presence so powerful that it felt as though it could see straight through me, reading every thought, every fear, every longing that had ever lived within me. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice a melody that resonated in my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out.
I didn't need to speak.
The figure understood me, understood everything about me in a way that felt both unsettling and comforting. "You have come far," it continued, its voice wrapping around me like the very air itself. "But your journey is not yet over. You have crossed into a place where time and space are malleable, where the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined no longer exist." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I had known this, felt it in every step I took. I had crossed into a space where logic, reason, and the laws of the universe held no sway. But now, standing before this figure, I realized that this was not just a place of mystery, it was a place of choice. "You have a decision to make," the figure continued. "You can stay here, in this realm, where all truths are known and all secrets are laid bare. Or you can return to the world you left behind, taking with you the knowledge you have gained and the experiences you have had." The weight of its words settled over me. I had known, deep down, that I was standing at the crossroads of something monumental. The choice seemed simple: stay and embrace the unknown, or return to the world I had once known, forever changed by what I had learned. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that neither option was truly possible. To stay here would mean losing myself, becoming part of something beyond comprehension. To return meant carrying a burden too heavy to bear, one that would change the very fabric of who I was. I stood there, caught in the liminal space between two worlds, unsure of what the right decision was. The figure didn't rush me. It waited, as patient as the universe itself. It knew, as I did, that this was not a decision to be made lightly. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I choose neither?" The figure's gaze softened, and a small smile touched the corners of its lips. "You already know the answer. You are not bound by the choices of this world or the next. You will carve your own path, as you always have." And in that moment, I understood. The journey I had undertaken was not about finding answers, nor was it about returning to the life I had once known. It was about embracing the journey itself, about moving forward without the burden of expectation or fear. The house, the figures, the monolith, the photograph, they were all symbols, not of a destination, but of the process. I wasn't meant to find the end. I was meant to live the journey, to experience every step along the way, and to find meaning in the moments of uncertainty and discovery. The landscape around me shimmered as I ventured deeper into this otherworldly space. The ground beneath my feet was soft, like walking on clouds, but the texture seemed to shift with every step. I couldn't quite put my finger on what was happening around me, but it felt as if time itself was slipping away, as if I had entered a place where the rules of the world I once knew no longer applied. The air, too, was different, cool but electric, humming with an energy I couldn't comprehend. I breathed it in, filling my lungs with something that seemed to clear my mind, to strip away the weight of doubt and fear I had carried with me for so long. The figures around me, those silent beings who had followed me through the portal, moved with purpose but without haste. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as if they were as familiar with the space as I was now becoming. They seemed to communicate without words, their movements graceful and fluid, as if we were all part of some grand choreography. I didn't know what they were or why they were here, but I had the distinct sense that they had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment to arrive. The house, the monolith, the photograph, each had brought me to this point, but it was something more, something beyond my understanding, that now bound me to them. As I walked, I noticed the space around me was constantly shifting, transforming into landscapes I had never seen before. One moment, I was walking through a dense forest, the trees towering above me, their leaves swirling in an unseen wind. The next, the ground beneath me morphed into an ocean, the water stretching out infinitely in every direction. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending, reshaping itself to reflect something deeper, something that lay just beyond the grasp of my consciousness. I reached out to touch the water, and as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a sudden surge of energy, like a pulse that traveled through my entire being. The figures paused as if they were waiting for something, and I felt an overwhelming sense of connection to them. They were more than just guides. They were part of me, and I was part of them. We were bound by something ancient, something that transcended time and space. The moment I made contact with the water, I felt a sudden flash of memories, fragments of lives I had never lived, of worlds I had never seen. Images flashed in my mind like a reel of film spinning too fast to process, but one thing was clear: I was not alone in this space. It was then that I saw the first glimpse of what lay beyond the horizon. A massive structure rose from the ground, towering high into the sky, its surface shimmering with the same light that pulsed around me. It wasn't made of any material I recognized, but it felt familiar, like it had always been here, waiting for someone to arrive. The figures began to move toward it, and I instinctively followed, my steps matching their rhythm as if we were all part of some predetermined journey. As we approached the structure, I felt a sense of awe and reverence wash over me. It was not just a building, it was a monument, a symbol of something far greater than I could comprehend. The closer I got, the more I realized that it wasn't just a structure in the physical sense. It was alive, breathing in sync with the pulse of the space around us. The surface of the building rippled, like a vast ocean, reflecting the shifting light of this strange world. The figures continued to move forward, and I followed, drawn by the same force that had brought me here. We entered the structure, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt a sudden change in the air. It was as if the very atmosphere inside the building was charged with a different energy, one that resonated deep within my soul. The figures moved with purpose, guiding me deeper into the heart of the structure, where the walls seemed to fade away, replaced by an endless expanse of light. It wasn't blinding, but it was all-encompassing, wrapping around me like a soft embrace. In the center of this space stood a figure. It was unlike the others, standing taller, its form more defined. It radiated an energy that was both soothing and overwhelming, as if it embodied everything this place represented. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. The figure looked at me, its presence so powerful that it felt as though it could see straight through me, reading every thought, every fear, every longing that had ever lived within me. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice a melody that resonated in my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out.
I didn't need to speak.
The figure understood me, understood everything about me in a way that felt both unsettling and comforting. "You have come far," it continued, its voice wrapping around me like the very air itself. "But your journey is not yet over. You have crossed into a place where time and space are malleable, where the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined no longer exist." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I had known this, felt it in every step I took. I had crossed into a space where logic, reason, and the laws of the universe held no sway. But now, standing before this figure, I realized that this was not just a place of mystery, it was a place of choice. "You have a decision to make," the figure continued. "You can stay here, in this realm, where all truths are known and all secrets are laid bare. Or you can return to the world you left behind, taking with you the knowledge you have gained and the experiences you have had." The weight of its words settled over me. I had known, deep down, that I was standing at the crossroads of something monumental. The choice seemed simple: stay and embrace the unknown, or return to the world I had once known, forever changed by what I had learned. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that neither option was truly possible. To stay here would mean losing myself, becoming part of something beyond comprehension. To return meant carrying a burden too heavy to bear, one that would change the very fabric of who I was. I stood there, caught in the liminal space between two worlds, unsure of what the right decision was. The figure didn't rush me. It waited, as patient as the universe itself. It knew, as I did, that this was not a decision to be made lightly. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I choose neither?" The figure's gaze softened, and a small smile touched the corners of its lips. "You already know the answer. You are not bound by the choices of this world or the next. You will carve your own path, as you always have." And in that moment I understood. The journey I had undertaken was not about finding answers, nor was it about returning to the life I had once known. It was about embracing the journey itself, about moving forward without the burden of expectation or fear. The house, the figures, the monolith, the photograph, they were all symbols, not of a destination, but of the process. I wasn't meant to find the end. I was meant to live the journey, to experience every step along the way, and to find meaning in the moments of uncertainty and discovery. With that realization, the figure stepped aside, allowing me to continue my journey. The space around me shifted once more, and I found myself standing in front of a door, simple, unadorned, yet brimming with the weight of possibility. Without hesitation, I reached for the handle and opened it. Beyond the door was the world I had left behind, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt like home, like a place where I could live fully, knowing that the journey was not about reaching the end, but about embracing the unknown with open arms. I stepped through, not with the certainty of answers, but with the courage to live the questions. As I stepped through the door and back into the world I thought I had left behind, I wasn't sure what to expect. The moment I crossed the threshold, the shift was subtle yet profound. The familiar sounds of the world filled my ears, the rustling of trees in the wind, the distant hum of cars on a highway, the soft chatter of people passing by. It was like nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. I could still see the same trees, the same houses, the same streets that I had known all my life, but now they held a deeper resonance. I felt like I was seeing the world for the first time, as if my eyes had been opened in a way that was impossible to explain. I stood in the middle of the street, looking around, trying to take it all in. I hadn't expected to feel so disconnected from everything I once knew. It wasn't that I didn't recognize it, it was just that there was something more to it now, something beneath the surface that I had never noticed before. The sky, for instance, seemed more vivid, the clouds more defined, as if they were swirling with an energy that hadn't been there before. The people around me moved about their lives, oblivious to the profound shift I had experienced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing things through a different lens now, as if I had crossed over into a new dimension of awareness. I continued walking, unsure of where I was going, but feeling drawn toward something I couldn't yet define. The figures, those silent beings who had accompanied me on my journey, were no longer by my side, but I knew that their presence was still with me. It was as if their energy had become a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. I could still feel the weight of their gaze, guiding me, watching over me. It was a comforting thought, but it also left me with a sense of responsibility, a responsibility to carry forward what I had learned, what I had discovered about myself and the world. As I walked, the path before me seemed to stretch out endlessly, and I realized that I had no destination in mind. That was the beauty of it. I didn't need a destination. The journey itself was the point. The realization that I didn't have to have all the answers, that I could simply exist in the moment, was liberating. It was as if the weight of all my previous struggles, all my desires for control, had melted away, leaving me with only the present. I could walk freely, without the pressure of figuring everything out, knowing that the answers would come in their own time. I eventually found myself at the edge of a park, the soft grass beneath my feet a welcome contrast to the concrete streets I had been walking on. The park was quiet, almost peaceful, and I sat down on a bench near a small pond. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the trees and the sky above. For a moment, everything felt still, and I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves wash over me. There was no urgency here, no pressure to move forward or to achieve anything. I was simply present, existing in this space, this moment. And that, I realized, was enough. I had always been someone who sought answers, who pushed myself to find solutions to every problem that came my way. I had spent so much of my life chasing after some ideal, some goal that I thought would bring me happiness, fulfillment, peace. But in this moment, I understood that the chase itself had always been the obstacle. It wasn't about finding the right answers or reaching some distant point on the horizon. It was about allowing myself to simply be, to exist fully in the present without the need to constantly strive for something more. The world was full of beauty, full of potential, but it was only when I let go of the need to control it that I could truly see it. I sat there for what felt like hours, just observing, just being. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the park. The air cooled, and I noticed the shift in the light, the way the shadows grew longer as the day gave way to night. Everything felt so alive, so real, in a way I had never experienced before. The world wasn't something I needed to change or fix. It was something I could simply appreciate, as it was in its raw beauty. I didn't need to chase after anything anymore. The pursuit of happiness, of meaning, had always been about the journey, not the destination. The moment I realized that, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. As the night deepened, I stood up from the bench, stretching my legs. The figures, those mysterious beings who had guided me on my journey, were still with me, though I could no longer see them. Their presence was like an unspoken truth, a knowing that accompanied me wherever I went. I had crossed through so many worlds, learned so much, and yet I realized that the most important lesson of all was this. I was not meant to control my path. I was meant to walk it, to experience it fully, with all its twists and turns, its surprises and challenges. I didn't need to force anything into being. Life would unfold in its own time, in its own way. I began to walk again, this time with no particular destination in mind. The world around me was alive with possibility, and I felt a sense of connection to everything I passed, the trees, the buildings, the people. They were all part of the same tapestry, all woven together by the same invisible thread. The more I walked, the more I felt the pull of something deep inside me, a quiet voice that urged me forward. There was more to discover, more to experience, and I was ready to embrace it all. The days that followed were a blur of experiences, simple, yet profound. I spent time in the quiet corners of the city, watching the world go by, letting the moments wash over me. I found solace in the small things, the way the sun filtered through the trees in the morning, the sound of birds singing in the early hours, the laughter of children playing in the streets. I began to realize that the answers I had been seeking were never outside of me. They were always within, in the way I chose to see the world, in the way I chose to be present in it. And then, one day, I found myself standing in front of the house where it had all started, the house I had walked away from, the house that had once seemed so full of mystery and possibility. As I stood there, looking at the familiar door, I understood that I had come full circle. I didn't need to return to the house, nor did I need to leave it behind. I had learned that I could carry the lessons I had gained with me wherever I went. The house, the portal, the figures, they had all been symbols, representations of the journey I had taken within myself. They weren't places I needed to revisit. They were experiences I had lived, and now they were part of me. I turned away from the house, smiling to myself. There was nothing more to find, no more places to explore. I had already discovered everything I needed to know. Life was here, in every moment, and it was waiting for me to embrace it fully. So I walked on, content in the knowledge that the journey would continue and that I didn't need to seek out anything more. The answers would come when they were meant to, and until then, I would simply live fully and completely in the flow of life. As I walked away from the house, the world around me seemed to hum with a quiet energy, like the pulse of life itself. It was as if every step I took was in perfect harmony with the rhythm of the universe, each footfall a note in a song that had been playing long before I had arrived, and would continue long after I was gone. The road ahead stretched out, not as a linear path, but as a vast open field of possibilities. I could go anywhere, do anything, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the need to rush. I didn't need to fill my life with goals or destinations. Instead, I was free to simply move, to live in the moment, letting whatever came next unfold naturally. The city had its usual hum, the buzz of people, the swish of car tires against wet asphalt, the distant murmur of conversations, but all of it seemed distant now. My thoughts felt clearer, less cluttered by the noise of everyday life. I could hear the deeper rhythms beneath the surface, the subtle breath of the wind, the way the earth seemed to sigh as the clouds shifted in the sky. There was a stillness that existed within me, a calm that spread out into everything I observed. And as I moved through the streets, I realized that nothing was truly separate. The trees were connected to the sky, the buildings to the ground, the people to the air they breathed. It was all one, an intricate dance of interconnectedness, and I was part of it, part of the song. I didn't know where I was going, nor did I feel the need to. As I wandered aimlessly, I felt that each step I took was a discovery, a revelation in itself. My surroundings no longer felt foreign, but familiar, like I had always known this place, and yet it felt new. Each turn I made revealed something I hadn't seen before, some hidden corner of the world that had always been there, just waiting to be noticed. The small cafe tucked away on a side street, the quiet alley where the ivy had grown thick over the years, the park bench where a couple sat together, watching the world go by. Each of these little moments held their own quiet magic, and I was here to witness it. As I continued my walk, I realized that the world hadn't changed, not in any physical sense. What had changed was the way I saw it. The things that once seemed mundane, traffic lights, storefronts, the sound of a distant horn, had taken on a deeper significance. They were all part of the grand tapestry, threads woven together by time and fate, and I was a part of that weaving. It was a comforting thought, knowing that I didn't have to stand apart from the world, that I didn't have to fight to belong. I was already a part of it, connected in ways I couldn't fully understand, but that didn't matter. The beauty lay in the mystery. I stopped by the edge of a fountain, the water bubbling gently as it cascaded over stones. The droplets caught the sunlight, refracting into tiny rainbows. I watched them for a moment, mesmerized by the way they danced in the light, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself be fully present. It wasn't about achieving anything, reaching any destination, or even understanding what I was experiencing.
It was simply about being here now.
The stillness, the peace, the quiet joy that came from the simplest of moments. This was what life was really about. I had spent so much time searching, trying to grasp something elusive, something that could fill the emptiness I had felt for so long. But the answer, I realized, had always been right in front of me. The world wasn't something to conquer or possess. It wasn't a place to search for answers or solutions. It was a space to experience, to feel, to be. And the more I allowed myself to surrender to it, the more I realized how much beauty I had overlooked in my quest for control. It was as if I had been standing in the middle of a garden, surrounded by flowers and trees, but instead of appreciating their beauty, I had been too focused on finding the path to some distant peak. Now, I understood that the peak had never been the point. The point was the journey, the moments that made up each day, each experience, each breath. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. It was invigorating, this simple act of breathing, this quiet connection to the world around me. For so long, I had been disconnected from my own body, from the rhythm of my own breath. I had been too caught up in the future, in the what-ifs and maybes, to notice the present, to feel the life coursing through me. But now, as I stood by the fountain, I felt the pulse of the earth beneath my feet, the beating of my own heart, and the gentle rhythm of my breath. It was all so simple, so beautifully simple, and yet it was enough. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts, and I opened my eyes to see a figure approaching. It was an elderly woman, her face lined with age, but her eyes sparkled with a kind of wisdom that only comes with time. She smiled at me as she passed, a small, knowing smile, as if she recognized something in me. I returned the smile, feeling a strange sense of connection to her, even though we were strangers. And as she disappeared around the corner, I realized something that made my heart swell with warmth. It didn't matter that we were strangers. We were all part of the same story, all connected in ways we often failed to see. She, too, was a part of this world, this moment, this experience. And that was enough. I continued my walk, the city stretching out before me, full of life and possibility. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was cool now, a soft breeze lifting the hairs on the back of my neck. I walked without purpose, without destination, letting my feet carry me wherever they wished. The world felt wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the need to control, free from the pressure to be something I wasn't. I was simply me, and that was enough. As the day gave way to night, the city began to change. The lights flickered on, casting a warm glow on the streets, and the sounds of traffic slowly faded, replaced by the hum of nighttime activity. People gathered in cafes, chatting softly, while others strolled down the sidewalks, lost in their own thoughts. The city was alive in a way that felt different now, less frantic and more peaceful. It was as if, like me, it had taken a breath, exhaling all the tension and anxiety that had built up over the years. I found myself at the edge of a small park, the grass soft beneath my feet. I sat on a bench, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky, twinkling like tiny jewels. The world around me seemed so vast, and yet, in this moment, it felt as if it was contained in the quiet space of my heart. I wasn't separate from it. I wasn't a visitor passing through. I was part of it, a piece of the grand puzzle, and I finally understood that my place in it didn't need to be figured out. It was already there, simply waiting for me to recognize it. As I sat there, the cool night air wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, I felt a deep sense of peace settle within me. The world was vast, yes, but I was part of it. And in this moment, I didn't need to understand everything. I didn't need to have all the answers. I simply needed to exist in the moment, and to embrace the beauty of life as it came. It was enough, and that was all I needed to know. With a final glance at the stars, I stood and began to walk once more, knowing that whatever came next, I would face it with an open heart, a clear mind, and a soul that had finally found peace. The journey was not over, but I no longer felt the need to race towards some distant goal. I was already here, already a part of it all. And that, I realized, was the most profound gift of all. The night air seemed to wrap itself around me as I walked, a soft caress that felt both familiar and new. It was as though the world had grown quieter, not just in sound but in its essence, its rhythm. There was something about this moment that invited reflection, that gently encouraged me to look back, not with regret, but with a sense of gratitude. I thought of all the paths I had taken, the choices I had made, and the lessons I had learned along the way. I had once been caught in the frantic chase for something, a purpose, an answer, a destination. But now I realized that the very act of living, of simply being, was enough. I didn't need to search for meaning outside of myself. The meaning was here, inside me, in each step, each breath, each quiet moment of existence. As I walked through the streets, my feet moving almost of their own accord, I felt a connection to the world around me that was deeper than anything I had ever experienced. The city, with its bustling energy, its crowd of strangers, now felt like a part of me, like a story unfolding in real time. Each person I passed had their own story, their own journey, and I wondered what it was that brought them to this point, at this hour, in this space. I realized how little we often know about the lives of the people around us, how much remains hidden behind the surface. And yet, even with all the hidden stories, we were all sharing this moment together, each of us a small piece of the larger puzzle that made up the world. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of a small park, a peaceful oasis tucked away between two buildings. It was quiet here, the soft rustle of leaves the only sound. I stepped inside, drawn by the tranquility that seemed to hang in the air like a veil. The grass was damp with dew, and the scent of earth and grass filled my senses. I sat on a bench beneath a tree, its branches reaching out like the arms of an old friend, offering comfort and shelter. The sky above was a deep shade of navy, and the first stars had begun to appear, twinkling faintly against the vast expanse. I gazed up at them, wondering how many of them had been burning for centuries, long before I had even been born, and how many would continue to burn long after I was gone. There was something humbling about that thought, something that reminded me of the fleeting nature of my own life, and yet, at the same time, it brought me peace. The stars had always been there, watching over the world, and they would continue to do so, whether or not I was around to see them. As I sat there, lost in thought, I noticed a figure approaching in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a passerby, but as the figure drew closer, I saw that it was a woman, her steps slow and deliberate. She was older, her hair silver with age, and her face was etched with the lines of a life well lived. There was a certain grace to her movements, as though she carried the weight of the years not with burden but with acceptance. She sat on the bench next to mine without saying a word, and for a moment, we both simply stared at the sky, lost in our own thoughts. I felt no need to speak, no need to break the silence. It was enough just to share this moment with her, two strangers sitting together beneath the stars. After a while, the woman spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You know," she said, "there was a time when I thought I had to figure everything out. I thought I had to have a plan, to know where I was going, to understand the purpose of it all. But now, I've come to realize that the beauty of life lies in the uncertainty. It's in the not knowing. That's where the magic is." Her words hung in the air between us, simple but profound. I couldn't help but smile, a quiet smile that came from a place of understanding. I had been there too, caught in the web of expectation and the pressure to know, to achieve, to be something. But now, sitting here with this woman, I felt the truth of her words seep into my soul. Life didn't have to make sense. It didn't have to follow a linear path or fit into a neat box. It was messy, unpredictable, and yet it was perfect in its imperfection. The woman glanced at me, as though sensing my thoughts. "You're still figuring it out, aren't you?" she asked gently. I nodded, not out of shame, but with a quiet acceptance. It was true. I was still figuring things out. I wasn't sure where I was going, or even if I had a destination in mind. But somehow, in this moment, that felt okay. In fact, it felt more than okay. It felt freeing. The pressure to have all the answers had lifted, and I could simply be. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't chasing anything. I wasn't trying to reach some distant goal. I was here, in this moment, with this woman, beneath the stars. And that was enough. The woman smiled knowingly, as if she had seen this realization before, perhaps in herself, perhaps in others. "You'll get there in your own time," she said. "But don't be in a rush. Life isn't a race. It's a journey. And sometimes, the most beautiful moments come when you stop trying to force things to happen." Her words resonated deep within me, echoing through my heart like a song I had always known but had forgotten. I realized that I had been so focused on the future, so obsessed with what was to come, that I had missed the beauty of what was already here. The people, the places, the quiet moments, the simple acts of kindness, these were the things that mattered. Not the destination, but the journey itself. As the night stretched on, the woman and I sat together in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The air was cooler now, but it felt refreshing, like a gentle reminder that change was constant, that nothing stayed the same for long. And yet, there was a timeless quality to this moment, a feeling that it would remain with me long after the night had passed. I knew I would remember this bench, this park, this conversation, as one of those rare moments in life when everything seemed to align. It was as though the universe had whispered to me, reminding me to slow down, to breathe, and to appreciate the small wonders that surrounded me. Eventually, the woman stood up, her movements slow but graceful. "I should be going," she said, her voice warm with a kind of quiet wisdom. "But I'm glad we met. You'll be okay, you know. You just have to trust that everything will unfold as it's meant to." I nodded, grateful for her words, and watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the night. I didn't feel sadness as she left, only a quiet sense of peace, as though her presence had left an imprint on my heart. I stayed there for a while longer, watching the stars, feeling the cool night air on my skin, and allowing the quiet to wash over me. It was amazing how something so simple, just sitting on a bench in a park, could feel so profound. I thought of everything I had learned in the past few days, the way I had begun to understand life in a new light. I had been so caught up in the chaos of the world, in the noise and the rush, that I had forgotten how to simply be.
But now I knew.
I knew that the key to happiness, to fulfillment, was not in achieving or understanding everything, but in embracing the uncertainty, the beauty, and the mystery of life. It was in letting go, in surrendering to the flow of existence, and trusting that everything would fall into place when the time was right. With a final glance at the stars, I stood up, ready to continue my journey, not knowing exactly where it would take me, but feeling content with the knowledge that, for now, I was exactly where I needed to be. The world was vast, full of possibility, but in this moment, I was at peace. And that, I realized, was enough. The next few days felt like a quiet journey of discovery, almost as if the world had shifted its rhythm just enough to allow me to notice the subtle beauty that had always been around me, but which I had never truly seen before. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through my own life, so consumed by thoughts of what I should be doing, where I should be going, and how things should unfold that I had completely forgotten how to simply live in the present. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if it were no longer weighted down by my own expectations and anxieties. Every breath felt deeper, richer, more connected to the world. One afternoon, I found myself walking down a familiar street I had passed countless times before. But today, for some reason, it felt different. The houses on either side of the road, with their neatly manicured lawns and colorful flowers, seemed to shimmer in the golden light of the afternoon sun. The trees, tall and proud, stretched their limbs toward the sky, casting long, lazy shadows across the sidewalk. I had always noticed these things, but now they seemed to speak to me in a way they hadn't before, as if each leaf, each blade of grass, and each ripple of sunlight was trying to tell me something. Perhaps I was simply more attuned to the world now, more aware of its rhythms, its subtle whispers, and its quiet hums. I paused at the corner, just standing there, watching the world move around me. A family passed by, laughing together as they made their way to the park down the street. A couple walked hand in hand, their fingers intertwined, moving in a synchrony that seemed almost effortless. A child ran ahead of his parents, his laughter echoing through the air as he raced to catch a butterfly that fluttered just out of his reach. I watched them all with a sense of wonder, as though I were seeing them for the first time, these simple moments of connection and joy, these tiny fragments of life that were often taken for granted. The world, I realized, was full of these moments, these fleeting glimpses of beauty that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was easy to miss them, to be too preoccupied with what came next, with a never-ending list of things to do and places to go. But now, in this quiet space, I understood the importance of being present, of truly seeing the world for what it was, not through the lens of a busy mind, but through the clarity of a calm heart. I continued my walk, letting my feet guide me without any particular destination in mind. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of people hurrying from one place to the next replaced by a peaceful stillness that seemed to permeate everything. As I walked, I noticed the small things, the way the light filtered through the trees, the sound of birds chirping in the distance, the faint scent of flowers carried on the breeze. It was as though the world had slowed down just for me, allowing me to savor its beauty, to immerse myself in the present moment without the distraction of time or expectation. By the time I reached the park, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the landscape. I found a quiet bench beneath a large oak tree and sat down, closing my eyes for a moment, just breathing, letting the peacefulness of the moment wash over me. There was no rush, no need to be anywhere, no desire to do anything other than simply exist in this space, in this time. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above me, and I listened to their rustling sound, feeling as though they were speaking to me, telling me something important. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears, but a quiet knowing, a deep sense of understanding that seemed to come from within. In this moment, it became clear to me that life was not something to be conquered, not something to be rushed toward or controlled. Life was meant to be lived, to be experienced in its fullness, in its beauty and its messiness. It was about finding peace not in the destination, but in the journey itself, in the quiet moments, the unexpected encounters, and the simple pleasures. The light around me was softening now, the sky shifting from golden to shades of pink and lavender. It was one of those rare, perfect evenings where everything seemed to align just right, where the world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something beautiful to happen. I could hear the distant sound of children's laughter coming from the playground, and I smiled, remembering what it was like to be young and carefree, to see the world through the lens of wonder and possibility. As an adult, it was easy to lose that sense of wonder, to become jaded by life's challenges and disappointments. But now, sitting there in the quiet of the park, I felt a renewed sense of possibility, a reminder that the world was still full of magic, if only I was open to it. The sun was almost set now, the sky painted in vibrant hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the park. I stood up from the bench, feeling the coolness of the evening air on my skin, and began to walk slowly back toward home. The world around me had changed in subtle ways, but the biggest shift had occurred within me. I no longer felt the need to chase after something, to grasp at the future, to worry about what would happen next. For the first time in a long time, I was content with the present moment, with the world as it was, without the pressure to make it something else. As I walked, I thought back to the conversation I had had with the woman in the park a few days earlier. Her words still echoed in my mind, their wisdom sinking deeper into my heart with each passing day. Life wasn't a race, she had said. And she was right. It wasn't about how fast I could get to the next milestone, or how many achievements I could rack up. It was about the quality of the moments I experienced along the way, about the people I met, the lessons I learned, and the joy I found in the simple, everyday things. I realized that I had spent so much of my life looking ahead, so focused on the future, that I had forgotten how to be fully present in the now. As I approached my home, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet knowing that everything was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. There was no need to force anything, no need to have everything figured out. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but that was part of the beauty. I stepped inside, the familiar comfort of home wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I made myself a cup of tea, the steam rising from the mug, filling the room with its soothing scent. I sat by the window, watching as the last light of day faded into night, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the quiet, simple moments that had made up my day. I had learned something important in the past few days, something that had shifted the way I saw the world. That life, in all its complexity, could be as simple as taking a breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin, and appreciating the quiet beauty that surrounded you. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue my journey. But for now, in this moment, I was content, and that I realized was enough. The days continued to pass slowly, each one an unfolding chapter in a story I hadn't expected to write, yet had somehow found myself in the middle of. Each morning, I awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation, not because there was something urgent I needed to do, but because I had begun to look at the world through a new lens, as though the everyday things I once took for granted held infinite possibilities. I began to savor the smallest moments, the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains in the morning, the sound of birds chirping outside my window, the comforting ritual of making a cup of tea. These moments, I realized, had always been there, waiting to be noticed, but I had been too busy rushing through life to truly appreciate them. As I sat in the cozy corner of my living room one afternoon, the soft hum of the world outside blending with the silence inside, I reflected on how much had changed. The restlessness that had once driven me seemed to have melted away, leaving behind a stillness that was both unfamiliar and incredibly peaceful. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when old habits crept back in, and I found myself questioning whether I was doing enough, whether I was progressing fast enough towards some unknown goal. But those moments were fleeting now, replaced by an inner quiet that reminded me that I didn't need to be constantly in motion to be moving forward. The journey was unfolding in its own time, in its own way, and I was simply part of it. I had spent so many years caught up in the idea of success, of achieving something grand, of reaching some distant summit that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. To exist without the weight of expectations, to breathe without the constant pressure of having to do more. I had been afraid of slowing down, afraid that if I wasn't constantly striving for something, I would lose momentum, that I would be left behind. But in this quiet, peaceful space, I realized that there was beauty in stillness, that the world didn't demand constant movement, that life wasn't a race to the finish line, but a series of moments to be experienced, savored, and lived. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned soft shades of pink and lavender, I found myself walking along the path that led through the park near my house. The air was cooler now, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the faintest trace of wildflowers. I walked slowly, my feet crunching against the gravel, taking in the sights and sounds around me. The park was peaceful, nearly empty except for a few people scattered across the open space, a couple sitting on a bench, a child playing with a kite, an elderly man reading a book beneath the shade of an oak tree. It was as if the world had paused here, in this small corner of the universe, and everything had become soft, muted, as though it were all waiting for something to happen. I sat on the same bench I had visited a few days before, the one beneath the large oak tree that had become my sanctuary. It was funny how something as simple as a bench, a tree, and the surrounding nature could feel so grounding, so comforting. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves seemed to whisper secrets to me, things I hadn't yet learned, things I didn't need to understand, but simply to feel. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze kiss my skin, the sounds of the world washing over me like a lullaby. In that moment, I realized something profound. It wasn't that I had found peace, but rather that I had learned how to let go of the things that had once kept me from it. I had spent so much time trying to control everything around me, trying to make things fit into neat little boxes, that I had forgotten the beauty of surrender. It wasn't about doing more or being more. It was about letting go of the need to force everything into place and simply allowing life to unfold in its own time. As I sat there, I thought about the people I had met in the past few weeks, how their lives had touched mine in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was the woman in the park who had shared her wisdom about letting go of expectations. There was the elderly man who had smiled at me as I walked past his house, his eyes crinkling with kindness as though he had lived a lifetime of quiet joy. There was the young boy who had chased after the butterfly, his laughter ringing through the air like music, a sound so pure and carefree that it had made my heart swell with emotion. All of these people, with their simple moments of connection, had reminded me that life wasn't about grand achievements or distant goals. It was about these small, fleeting moments, these brief encounters, that made everything worthwhile. I stood up from the bench, feeling the weight of the day lifting off my shoulders. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the park, and the air had grown cooler, more comfortable. I felt a gentle tug in my heart, a sense of something pulling me forward, and I began to walk again, this time with no particular destination in mind. I wandered through the park, taking my time, letting my feet guide me wherever they chose. It was a walk with no agenda, no purpose other than to enjoy the journey itself. As I walked, I began to notice even more details, more beauty in the world around me. The way the last rays of sunlight danced across the leaves, turning them to gold. The way the flowers in the garden seemed to glow in the fading light, their colors deepening with the evening. The way the sky above me was slowly darkening, the stars beginning to peek through the veil of dusk. Everything seemed to be happening in perfect harmony, each moment unfolding exactly as it should, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle in my chest. It was a feeling I had long forgotten, the feeling of being truly present, of being fully alive in the moment. I didn't need to chase anything, to reach for some distant goal. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all myself. All I needed to do was breathe, to experience the world as it was, to appreciate the beauty that was always there, waiting to be noticed. As I reached the edge of the park, I found myself standing at a small bridge that crossed over a gently flowing stream. The water glimmered in the last light of day, its surface rippling gently as it moved downstream. I leaned on the railing of the bridge, watching the water flow beneath me, and I thought about how life was much like the stream. It flowed constantly, never stopping, never looking back. It didn't worry about where it was going or how long it would take to get there. It simply moved in its own time, in its own rhythm, trusting that the journey was enough. And in that moment, I understood. I didn't need to know the destination. All I needed to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, trusting that the path would unfold as it was meant to. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs, and as I exhaled, I let go of all the doubts, the fears, and the expectations that had once weighed me down. I didn't need to control everything. I didn't need to have everything figured out. I simply needed to trust the flow of life, to trust the journey, and to let it unfold in its own perfect way. With a renewed sense of clarity, I turned and walked back toward home, the stars now beginning to twinkle in the sky above me. The world felt vast and infinite, yet so close, so intimate, as if the universe itself were wrapping its arms around me in a quiet embrace. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to achieve. There was only this moment, and it was enough. As I made my way back through the park, the evening grew darker. The last vestiges of sunlight had disappeared, leaving the world bathed in soft moonlight. The park, once vibrant and alive, was now quiet and still, except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. The cool breeze whispered through the trees, and for a moment, I felt as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Nothing needed to happen. I passed the same bench where I had sat earlier, beneath the old oak tree, and I couldn't help but pause. It had become more than just a place to sit. It had become a symbol of everything I had come to understand. A place of stillness. A place to simply be. I touched the back of the bench lightly, my fingers brushing against the rough wood, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, taking in the sounds and sensations of the world around me. It felt as though the earth itself was exhaling, a deep, quiet breath that resonated with the very fabric of the universe. The idea of being at peace with oneself, of surrendering to the ebb and flow of life, was something I had only recently come to terms with. I had always thought that peace came from achieving certain goals or from reaching the mountaintop of success. But now, I realized that true peace was in accepting the present moment, in letting go of the need to control everything, and simply allowing life to unfold as it would. It was something that couldn't be forced or rushed. It had to come naturally, like the slow unfolding of a flower, or the steady movement of the river I had seen earlier. As I continued my walk, I felt the weight of the day lift from my shoulders, the worries and anxieties of the past slowly dissipating. I walked without destination, without purpose other than to enjoy the experience of walking itself. There was no urgency in my steps, no need to be anywhere other than where I was. And as I walked, I began to feel something shift within me, something deeper than just the quiet of the evening. It was a sense of connection, a feeling that the world was not separate from me, but part of me, that the trees, the grass, the sky, and the stars above were all intricately connected, and so was I. It was a realization that brought both comfort and awe. I had always felt that I was an individual, separate from the world around me. But now, I felt as though I was part of a much larger tapestry, one that stretched far beyond my understanding. It was a humbling thought, yet it didn't make me feel small or insignificant. Instead, it made me feel as though I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. There was no need to fight against the current of life, to try to swim upstream, because I was already exactly where I needed to be. The stars above twinkled brightly now, casting a soft glow across the park. I looked up, allowing the vastness of the sky to take in all my attention. The stars seemed to go on forever, their lights flickering in patterns I couldn't quite understand. I had always been captivated by the night sky, fascinated by the sheer number of stars that filled it. It was a reminder of how vast the universe was, how small my life seemed in comparison. And yet, in that moment, it didn't matter. The vastness of the sky didn't make me feel lost or insignificant. Instead, it made me feel a deep sense of peace, knowing that I was a part of something much larger, something that stretched far beyond my comprehension, and that was enough. I didn't need to understand everything, didn't need to have all the answers. Life wasn't about figuring everything out, but about experiencing it, embracing the mystery, and finding beauty in the unknown. The quiet moments, the ones where I simply existed without striving for anything, were the moments that had the most meaning. They were the moments that connected me to everything else, that reminded me that I wasn't alone in this world. I was part of a living, breathing universe, and that was more than enough. As I walked back to my home, the night wrapping itself around me like a soft blanket, I felt a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't known in a long time. There was no need to chase after anything. The world was already perfect, just as it was, and so was I. I didn't need to be anyone other than who I was in that moment. I didn't need to be constantly moving, constantly striving. I could just be. And in that being, there was a profound sense of peace. When I reached my front door, I paused for a moment, looking out over the quiet street. The world felt still, yet alive, as though everything was perfectly balanced in this fleeting moment. I opened the door, stepping into the warmth of my home, and closed it softly behind me. The house was quiet, and I welcomed the silence, the stillness that had become my new companion. I felt at home, not just in the space I inhabited, but within myself. There was no longer a need to search for meaning outside of myself. The meaning was in the present, in the way I moved through the world, in the way I interacted with it. I took off my shoes and walked into the kitchen, the soft light from the overhead lamps casting a gentle glow on the room. The house was simple, but it felt like a sanctuary now, a place where I could rest and recharge, where I could just be without any expectations. I moved through the space slowly, taking my time, savoring the quiet, the stillness. The world outside was asleep, and for a moment, I felt as though I could hear the gentle rhythm of life pulsing through the house, through me. I made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual grounding me, reminding me that the simple things, the everyday things, were enough. I didn't need to go out and seek grand adventures, or constantly chase after new experiences. The beauty of life was right here, in these simple, ordinary moments. I didn't need to run anymore. I could stand still, and the world would come to me. As I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my tea, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had led me to this moment. The experiences, the lessons, the people I had met along the way, they had all been stepping stones, guiding me to this place of understanding. I had spent so much of my life trying to figure out the answers, trying to control everything, but now I knew that the answers were not something to be found. They were something to be experienced, to be lived. Life wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, the moments of connection, the quiet realizations that came when I allowed myself to simply be. As I finished my tea and stood up, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a deep sense of contentment that I hadn't known in a long time. I didn't need anything else. I was already enough, just as I was. The world was already enough, just as it was. I didn't need to chase after anything. All I needed to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, with an open heart and a quiet mind. And in doing so, I would find everything I had been searching for, not in the world outside, but within myself. With that thought, I walked to my bedroom, the soft hum of the night surrounding me. I climbed into bed, the warmth of the blankets comforting me, and closed my eyes. There was no more need to do. There was no more need to seek. There was only this moment, this stillness, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The night passed peacefully, the quiet of the house embracing me as I slept. Dreams came and went, as they always do, shifting between moments of clarity and confusion. In the morning, when the first light of day broke through the curtains, I woke slowly, the comfort of the bed holding me in place for a few moments longer. There was no rush today, no pressure to get up and face the world outside. The day was mine to do with as I pleased, and I had no intentions of spending it in haste. I stretched my arms above my head, feeling the muscles that had grown stiff from the long, restful night begin to loosen. It was a feeling that had become rare for me, this luxury of time. I had spent so much of my life running, trying to keep up with the constant demands of the world, that I had forgotten what it felt like to just exist without obligation. Now, with this new understanding, I was learning how to savor the moments that had always been available to me, but which I had previously overlooked. I rolled out of bed and padded softly to the window. The air outside was still cool, the early morning mist hanging in the air like a gentle veil. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sun to fully rise. I pulled open the curtains and let the light spill into the room, filling it with warmth and a soft glow. The trees outside swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly, as if they were whispering secrets to one another. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of peace that came from simply witnessing the world in its quiet morning beauty. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the street. Birds began to sing their morning songs, their melodies intertwining with the distant hum of life beginning to stir. It was a peaceful, almost sacred moment, a reminder that each day was an opportunity, a new beginning. I took a deep breath, allowing the stillness of the morning to fill me. There was something about the early hours that always felt like the world was still in a state of possibility, untouched by the busyness that would inevitably come later. As I made my way to the kitchen, the familiar routine of preparing my morning coffee felt comforting. I wasn't in a rush today, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to be. I allowed myself the time to enjoy the simple process, to inhale the aroma of the coffee as it brewed, to watch the steam rise from the cup and curl into the air like a delicate wisp of smoke. There was something magical about the act of making coffee, something meditative. Each step, from the grinding of the beans to the final pour, felt deliberate and intentional, and I found myself savoring every moment of it. I took my time with the coffee, carrying it to the small table by the window, where I often sat to reflect. The world outside was coming alive now, the quiet morning giving way to the hustle and bustle of the day. People were starting to walk their dogs, children were heading off to school, and the occasional car drove by on the street. Yet, in my small corner of the world, there was still a sense of calm, a reminder that peace was always available, even amidst the chaos of daily life. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the previous day, about the quiet walk through the park and the realization that had come to me there. I had been so focused on the idea of achieving something, of finding some elusive purpose or goal, that I had forgotten to simply be. The idea that peace was not something to be sought, but something to be experienced in the present moment, had shifted something within me. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and I could now see the world with new eyes. I didn't need to chase after anything. Everything I needed was already here, within me and around me. The beauty of the world, the simple joys of life, were enough. The realization was both humbling and freeing. For so long, I had been driven by the need to achieve, to prove something to myself and to others. I had believed that my worth was tied to what I could accomplish, to the goals I could meet, to the image I could project. But now, I saw that true fulfillment came not from external achievements, but from internal peace. It came from letting go of the need for validation, from accepting myself just as I was. It was a lesson I had been learning for years, but it had finally clicked. I didn't need to prove anything. I was enough. The quiet of the morning wrapped itself around me like a soft blanket, and I allowed myself to fully embrace it. I didn't rush to fill the silence with noise or distractions. I simply sat there, in the stillness, allowing my mind to wander as it pleased. Thoughts came and went, some of them profound, others trivial, but none of them held any weight. I didn't feel the need to hold on to any one of them. I simply let them pass through me, like clouds drifting across the sky. The day stretched out before me, wide open and full of possibility. There were no specific plans, no expectations, and yet I felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that whatever I chose to do, it would be enough. I didn't need to fill the day with accomplishments or tasks to feel fulfilled. The simple act of being alive, of existing in this moment, was enough. As the morning wore on, I found myself drawn outside once again. The park was calling to me, its quiet paths and towering trees offering a peaceful refuge from the busyness of life. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a light jacket, and made my way out the door. The air was crisp, the sky still overcast with the remnants of morning fog. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, but for once, I didn't need to know what that something was. I didn't need to rush forward. I could simply walk, simply be, and that was enough. The park was quieter now than it had been the previous day, the early morning joggers and dog walkers having already come and gone. Only a few scattered figures remained, some sitting on benches, others walking slowly along the paths, lost in their own thoughts. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches reaching high into the sky like ancient sentinels, and I found myself drawn to the shade of the large oak tree where I had sat the day before. There was something grounding about that spot, something that made me feel at peace with myself and the world around me. I sat on the bench, feeling the cool wood beneath me, and closed my eyes for a moment. The sounds of the park, the rustling leaves, the distant chirp of birds, filled my senses. The world seemed to slow down here, as if time itself was taking a pause. I breathed deeply, allowing the fresh air to fill my lungs, and with each exhale, I felt the weight of the previous days lift from me. There was no need to hurry, no need to get anywhere. I was exactly where I needed to be. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the world go by, content to simply exist in the moment. The sun had risen higher in the sky now, casting dappled light through the leaves above me. The park was beginning to feel more alive, the colors of the trees and flowers vibrant in the sunlight. A family walked by, laughing and talking, and I smiled to myself, grateful for the simple joys of life. This was it, I realized. This was the beauty of life. Not in the big, dramatic moments, but in the small, quiet moments of connection, of stillness, of simply being present. As the afternoon wore on, I knew that I would carry this sense of peace with me, no matter where I went or what I did. It was a peace that came not from external circumstances, but from within. It was a peace that I could return to whenever I needed it, a peace that was always available to me, as long as I was willing to stop and listen. And in that moment, sitting beneath the oak tree, I understood something profound. Peace was not a destination to be reached, but a way of being. It was something that existed in every moment, if only I was open to it. With that realization, I stood up, stretched my arms, and began walking slowly toward the path that would take me home. The world felt different now, softer, more forgiving. I no longer felt the need to race through life, to constantly strive for something more. I was already enough. I was already whole. And with that knowledge, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the day, but for the life I had been given. Every step I took, every breath I drew, felt like a gift, and I was ready to embrace it fully. As I walked through the park, the path seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The trees, now fully bathed in sunlight, cast long shadows across the ground. The breeze had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above, carrying with it a fresh, earthy scent that grounded me even more deeply in the present moment. There was something peaceful about this part of the world, something that had always been there, but that I had only just begun to notice. Each step I took felt deliberate, as though I were not merely walking, but participating in the rhythm of the earth itself. The sound of my footsteps on the gravel path was a soft, almost meditative rhythm, syncing with the beat of my own heart. I thought about all the times I had rushed through life, my mind constantly churning with thoughts of the future, always looking for the next thing. How often had I missed the beauty that lay around me simply because I was too focused on what was to come? I couldn't help but smile at the realization that this moment, right here, was the culmination of everything I had been searching for. There was no need to look ahead any longer, no need to chase something that might not even exist. I had arrived, not at some distant goal or achievement, but at a state of peace. The park seemed to reflect my inner calm. There were still a few people scattered about, each lost in their own world. A couple sat on a bench near the lake, their heads bent close together, speaking softly, their words a quiet hum that blended with the chirping of birds. A jogger passed me by, his breath steady, his steps sure, yet there was no urgency in his movement. It was as if, in this shared space, everyone understood the quiet agreement. This was a place to be, not to do. The world outside may have been rushing, but here, there was only the present, and that was enough. I reached the edge of the park and paused, taking a moment to look back. The trees, their leaves now shimmering in the sunlight, seemed to stand as silent sentinels, guarding the peace of the place. It was hard to put into words what I felt. It wasn't just the beauty of the park, or the stillness of the morning that had taken root in me. It was the realization that this place, this moment, was the epitome of everything I had been craving. It wasn't about running away from the noise or the chaos of life. It was about learning to find peace within it. I had spent so long trying to control everything, thinking that if I could just get everything in order, then I could relax. But now I saw that the only thing I needed to do was to let go. Let go of the need to control. Let go of the need to be perfect. Let go of the constant search for something that would give me peace. The path ahead seemed like an open invitation, yet I didn't feel any rush to follow it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't burdened by the thought of what I should be doing next. I could walk or I could stop. I could turn back or continue forward. The world was full of choices, and yet, in this moment, there was no urgency to make any of them. I simply was, and that was enough. I walked slowly, letting my thoughts drift as I went. The air was warm now, but still gentle, the soft sunlight playing on my skin. It felt like the world had softened somehow, as if the edges had blurred and everything had settled into a more comfortable rhythm. I passed by a small cafe, its outdoor seating area lined with potted plants and hanging vines. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted toward me, mingling with the scent of blooming flowers. Without really thinking about it, I found myself walking toward the entrance, the cool metal doorframe welcoming me into the space. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting, with soft music playing in the background. The low murmur of conversation filled the air, but it wasn't loud or intrusive. It was as if the whole place had adopted the same slow pace I had come to appreciate so much that morning. I walked up to the counter, greeted by a barista who smiled at me with a warmth that matched the atmosphere. There was no rush here either. The world outside could wait, but in this space, time seemed to stretch in a way that allowed everyone to breathe a little easier. I ordered a coffee not because I needed it, but because it felt right, part of the quiet ritual of enjoying something simple. As I waited for my order, I looked around the cafe, noticing the small details. The shelves lined with books, the paintings on the wall, the way the light filtered through the windows, casting a golden hue on the wooden floors. Everything felt intentional, as though it had all been placed with care, not for perfection, but for the sake of creating a space where people could pause and take a breath. When my coffee was ready, I took it with a quiet thank you and made my way to a table by the window. I sat down, cradling the warm mug in my hands, and let my gaze wander outside. The park was still there, just a short distance away, but it felt as if the world outside had become quieter somehow. As I sipped the coffee, I thought about all the times I had been so focused on achieving something, on reaching some far-off point in the future. But now I knew that the real gift was not in the destination, but in the moments in between. The coffee was rich, the warmth of it spreading through me, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, letting myself just be. There was no need to chase anything, no need to force anything to happen. Life was unfolding at its own pace, and all I had to do was show up for it. The idea seemed so simple now, but it had taken me years to arrive at this point. I had been so caught up in the pursuit of success, in the pressure of being someone or achieving something, that I had forgotten what it meant to truly live. As the day wore on, I made my way back to the park, lingering on the simple beauty that seemed to surround me. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, but the air was still pleasant, a reminder that even in the heat of the day, there was room for ease. I walked slowly through the paths, allowing my thoughts to settle into a quiet rhythm, like the sound of waves crashing gently on the shore. I wasn't thinking about what I had to do next. I wasn't wondering if I was on the right path or if I was wasting time. All I knew was that this moment, this walk, this world, was exactly where I needed to be. And in that realization, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. It wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't about finding some elusive truth. It was about accepting the world as it was and allowing myself to be a part of it without striving for something more. It was a peaceful surrender, a quiet understanding that I was enough, just as I was. The park had transformed into a living tapestry of sound and color. Children ran past me, their laughter ringing in the air. A couple walked hand in hand, their steps in sync with one another. The trees swayed in the breeze, their leaves rustling like a secret whispered between old friends. And through it all, I moved with a calmness that felt foreign yet familiar at the same time. It was as though, in these small moments, I was becoming something new, something gentler, something more present. When I reached the spot by the oak tree again, I sat down, letting the coolness of the earth seep into me. I leaned back against the trunk, closing my eyes for a moment, and let the world unfold around me. It was a perfect moment, but I wasn't trying to hold on to it. I wasn't trying to make it last forever. I was simply living it, experiencing it in all its quiet beauty. And for the first time, I felt a sense of true peace, not in the things I had done or the things I was trying to accomplish, but in the act of being here, now. The day eventually began to fade into evening, the soft golden light giving way to the cool blues and purples of night. The park was quieter now, the last few people heading home as the sky darkened above them. I stood up slowly, stretching my legs, and began to walk back toward the entrance. There was no rush, no hurry. The world could wait. For now, I was content to simply be. As I made my way home, I realized that the journey I had been on wasn't just about finding peace in the world around me. It was about finding peace within myself. It was about letting go of the need to be perfect, to have everything figured out, and instead, learning to embrace the uncertainty, the beauty, and the simplicity of life as it unfolded before me. And with that understanding, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought me to this point. The struggles, the triumphs, and the quiet moments in between. They had all led me here, to this place of stillness, of peace. And in that, I found everything I had been searching for. The night grew deeper, the cool air now a comforting embrace that urged me to slow down even more. There was something deeply soothing about the quiet of the evening, a sense of the world winding down that matched my own shifting energy. I had been walking for hours, allowing the evening to unfold naturally around me, but as the last few rays of the sun dipped behind the horizon, I felt a pull to find a place to rest. My body was tired, not from exertion, but from the soft rhythm of the day, a rhythm that had somehow brought everything into balance. The path I had followed through the park began to merge into a smaller trail, one that I hadn't noticed before. I found myself intrigued by it, as if it were inviting me to take a step into the unknown. The trees lining the path seemed to stretch higher here, their branches intertwining like old friends deep in conversation. The leaves whispered in the wind, their rustling a gentle melody that resonated with something deep inside me. I continued forward, feeling a lightness in my steps, as though the path itself was guiding me towards something unexpected. I passed through a small clearing where the trees opened up, revealing a quiet pond. The water was still, its surface mirroring the deepening colors of the sky above. The moon had risen, a soft silver orb that reflected in the water like a quiet promise. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks, and I stood there for a moment, mesmerized by the simple beauty of the scene. Everything around me felt untouched, like a secret world that had been waiting for me to discover it. I took a seat on the ground, my back resting against the trunk of a nearby tree. The earth beneath me was cool, but it felt grounding, as though it were holding me in place. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing the peacefulness of the pond and the surrounding woods to wash over me. There was no need to chase anything anymore, no need to seek anything outside of myself. Everything I had been searching for was right here, within the stillness, within the quiet moments that seemed to stretch out endlessly. It was then that I realized how far I had come, not just in this day, but in my life. How often had I moved through the world in a hurry, always chasing something I thought would bring me fulfillment. And yet, here I was simply being, and it felt like everything I had ever needed had come together. It wasn't about finding a destination. It was about learning to savor the journey. Each step I had taken in the past had led me here, to this moment of profound stillness. The pond before me seemed to hold a certain magic, an unspoken invitation to dive deeper into the mystery of life. Its surface, still and reflective, appeared to be a mirror for my own thoughts. I found myself contemplating the simple truths that had eluded me for so long. Perhaps the key to peace wasn't in what we accomplished, but in how we experienced each moment. Perhaps, by letting go of the need to control everything, we could finally see the beauty that was always there. I sat for what felt like an eternity, yet the time passed without any sense of urgency. The moonlight grew stronger, casting long, delicate shadows across the clearing, and the air grew cooler. The chirping of crickets filled the silence, their song a soft accompaniment to the stillness around me. I felt a deep connection to the earth, as if the trees and the water were part of me, reminding me of the interconnectedness of all things. I could have stayed there forever, in that perfect peace, but eventually the pull of reality began to tug at me. It was time to go back, to re-enter the world I had left behind, but I wasn't sure I was ready to. It felt as though this moment of serenity had unlocked something within me, something that had been dormant for far too long. As I stood up and began to walk back along the path, I felt a sense of reluctance. The world beyond the woods, with its noise and chaos, seemed distant now, as though I had left it behind in my quiet reverie. The walk back was slower, more deliberate. I had no need to rush, no need to race against time. The world seemed to have slowed down with me, and as I passed the familiar landmarks of the park, I noticed things I had missed earlier. The delicate way the light filtered through the leaves, the small details in the architecture of the benches and pathways, even the way the air felt warmer now, as if the evening had wrapped me in its gentle embrace. When I reached the entrance to the park, I stopped for a moment, looking out at the world beyond. The lights of the city glowed faintly in the distance, but it was the quiet of the night that drew me in. The park, the pond, the trees, they had all become a part of me. a reminder of the peace that was always within reach if I only knew how to quiet my mind enough to hear it. I stepped out of the park and into the streets, but something inside me had shifted. The world around me still buzzed with activity, but I felt strangely detached from it. I didn't need to engage with it, didn't need to chase after it. I was content in my own space, in my own peace. As I walked through the streets, I could hear the hum of life around me, the distant sounds of conversation, the soft rush of cars passing by, but they seemed to fade into the background, as if they were no longer my concern. I had found my own rhythm, my own pace, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I returned home as the night deepened, the stars now a glittering blanket overhead. The familiar surroundings of my apartment greeted me, but it felt different now. The walls, the furniture, even the soft hum of the refrigerator, they all seemed less important, less pressing. The world inside my apartment, like the world outside, could wait. It was a strange realization, this sense of detachment, but also a comforting one. I had learned something that day, something I would carry with me moving forward. I had learned that peace was not something to be found out there, in the world or in achievements. It was something to be cultivated within, something that existed in the stillness between thoughts and in the quiet moments between actions. As I prepared for bed, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. I had spent so many years running, so many years trying to find something that I thought would bring me happiness, only to discover that happiness was never something to be chased. It had always been here, in the present moment, waiting for me to slow down enough to recognize it. I closed my eyes and let out a soft sigh, knowing that tomorrow would bring with it more opportunities to simply be. And in that peace, in that simplicity, I found something far more valuable than anything I could have ever achieved. I had found myself, and that was enough. The next morning, the soft glow of dawn slowly filled my room. It was the kind of morning where the world felt fresh, as if the night had washed away any lingering tiredness, leaving only possibility in its wake. I woke up without an alarm, the natural light gently nudging me from my dreams. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully rested, not just physically, but mentally. There was a clarity in the air, and for a moment, I lingered in bed, savoring the stillness, the quiet hum of the world beyond my window. It was a moment of pause, of reflection, before the day began. I rose from my bed and stretched, feeling the subtle pull of my muscles as I moved. The apartment was still and peaceful, a haven of sorts. The events of yesterday, my walk through the park, the pond, the realization that had settled in my heart, were still vivid in my mind, and I felt an inner calm I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't that my life was without challenges, or that everything was perfect, but for the first time, I realized that I no longer needed to fight for peace. It had always been there, tucked within me, waiting to be acknowledged. As I made my way to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea, I reflected on the simplicity of the morning. No rush, no pressure, just the ritual of boiling water, steeping the leaves, and savoring the aroma that filled the space. There was something grounding about these small rituals, something that anchored me in the present. I found myself thinking about the choices I had made in my life, the decisions I thought were important at the time, the paths I had taken in search of fulfillment, of meaning. But now, I understood that perhaps the meaning wasn't in the destination, but in the journey itself, in the little moments of peace we sometimes forget to notice. I carried my tea to the small window seat in the corner of my apartment, looking out at the quiet street below. It was early, and the city had not yet fully woken up. The streets were still and empty, with only the occasional car passing by. I watched the world slowly begin to stir, people going about their morning routines, each one moving through their day, just as I was. But there was a part of me that felt connected to them, as if we were all moving in rhythm with the same heartbeat. It was a beautiful thought, and in that quiet moment, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never experienced before. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I felt a desire to go back to the park, to revisit the peaceful place where I had found my clarity the day before. The idea of it was comforting, like returning to a familiar place that held the answers to questions I hadn't yet asked. I put on my shoes and stepped outside, letting the cool air greet me as I walked down the familiar streets. The city had begun to wake up now, the sounds of traffic and voices filling the air. But there was a certain rhythm to it, a pulse that seemed to mirror my own. When I reached the park, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The trees still stood tall, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The path I had taken the day before stretched out before me, inviting me to walk it once again. This time, though, I walked slower, allowing myself to truly experience the world around me. The sound of birds calling, the scent of the earth, the way the light filtered through the branches. All of it felt like a reminder that I didn't need to hurry. I didn't need to be anywhere other than right here, right now. I found myself drawn back to the same clearing where the pond had been. The stillness of the water greeted me like an old friend, its surface untouched by the wind. I sat on the same patch of grass, this time taking a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. The world around me seemed to slow down, the noise of the city fading away until all that was left was the sound of my own thoughts. It was in this quiet that I realized how much I had been running from. The distractions, the constant striving, the need to achieve. These were the things that had kept me from truly living. But now I could let them go. I could choose to simply be. The pond in front of me was a perfect metaphor for that. Its surface remained undisturbed, reflecting the world around it, yet it held a depth that I could never fully comprehend. It was content in its stillness, content in its own existence. And maybe, just maybe, I could learn to be the same. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the park wash over me. The birds, the wind, the distant murmur of traffic. It all blended together into a symphony of life. I was no longer searching for anything, no longer longing for something more. In this moment, I was enough, and that realization filled me with a quiet joy, the kind that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, but was deeply felt within. As the hours passed, the sun shifted in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The park began to fill with people, families walking their dogs, joggers passing by, friends laughing together. But none of it seemed to disrupt the peace I had found. I watched them, but I wasn't focused on them. I was focused on the space within me, the stillness that now existed in the center of my being. Eventually, the time came to leave. I stood up slowly, brushing the grass from my clothes, and began to walk back along the path. The world had resumed its normal rhythm, but I no longer felt out of step with it. I was no longer trying to catch up or keep pace. I was simply moving with it, allowing the flow of life to carry me where it would. When I returned home, I felt a sense of completeness, as if I had learned something valuable during my time in the park. The day hadn't been extraordinary in any obvious way, but it had been profound in its simplicity. It was a reminder that life doesn't always need to be dramatic or filled with constant motion. Sometimes, the most meaningful moments are the quiet ones, the ones where we simply stop and listen to the world around us. The evening passed slowly, the light fading as the night crept in. I spent the rest of the evening in the same peaceful way, cooking a simple meal, reading a book, and allowing the quiet to fill the space. It was a perfect ending to a perfect day, and as I prepared for bed, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with myself and with the world. It was a peace that wasn't dependent on circumstances, but on my ability to be present, to be still, and to accept life as it was. And so, as I drifted off to sleep that night, I carried with me the quiet wisdom I had found in the park, knowing that the journey was not about achieving some grand goal or finding some distant destination. It was about learning to live each moment fully, with grace and acceptance, and finding peace within the simplicity of being. And in that knowing, I found a quiet joy, a joy that was enough for now, and enough for always. The following days were more or less a continuation of the peace I had found. There was no immediate rush, no overwhelming drive to achieve or accomplish anything in particular. In fact, I had come to cherish the slow unfolding of time, where every little thing held meaning, no matter how small it seemed. There were mornings where I woke up and simply sat at my window, watching the light filter through the trees in the courtyard. The same trees I had walked past 1,000 times before, but now they felt different. Their leaves, bright green and shimmering under the morning sun, seemed to have a story to tell. And perhaps they did. Perhaps it was just a matter of taking the time to listen. I had come to realize that every day held a quiet promise, a promise that if I slowed down enough, I could find beauty in even the most ordinary things. It wasn't that my life had suddenly become perfect or without challenges, but I had learned to be okay with the ebb and flow of life, the quiet moments of contentment that didn't necessarily require action or excitement. They were enough in themselves. Each step I took, each breath I inhaled, became a meditation in its own right. And in this way, I began to appreciate the stillness, the moments when there was nothing to do, but simply be. It wasn't long before I started to take longer walks again, this time not just through the park, but along the paths that led me further into the quieter parts of the city. It was as though the city itself had opened up to me, revealing its hidden corners. In the past, I might have rushed past these areas, too busy with the demands of daily life to notice the small wonders. But now, I found myself wandering down alleyways I had never noticed before, marveling at the details of the old buildings, the way the sunlight played on the cobblestones, the peacefulness of these forgotten spaces. Each one felt like a new discovery, a place to pause and reflect, and perhaps to let the city speak its quiet wisdom. I began to realize that there were many layers to this world I had been missing, layers that could only be appreciated when I slowed down long enough to truly see them. I also noticed the people around me in a way I hadn't before. There was a woman in the cafe down the street who always smiled when she handed me my coffee. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now I found myself savoring the warmth of that small interaction, the kindness in her eyes as she passed me my cup. There was the elderly man who walked his dog every morning, slow and steady, his dog wagging its tail happily as they strolled down the street. I'd seen them both 100 times before, but now they felt like part of the fabric of the city, as important as the trees or the birds in the park. Life, it seemed, was full of these small moments, these tiny connections that formed the web of existence. I had spent so much of my life focused on the bigger picture, on what was coming next, on the future, on the next task to complete. But now, it felt like the present was a treasure chest, waiting to be opened, each moment holding a small gem of experience, something to cherish and remember. One afternoon, I found myself at the park again, sitting by the pond, my feet dipping into the cool water. The sunlight glinted off the surface of the water, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the place wash over me, and when I opened them again, I saw a young couple walking along the path. They were laughing, holding hands, their eyes bright with affection for one another. It was such a simple thing, but it struck me deeply. There was something so pure in their joy, something so unguarded and natural. In that moment, I was reminded that love was not just about the grand gestures, the sweeping declarations, but about these quiet, everyday moments of connection, of being with someone in a way that felt effortless. It was as if the world had opened its arms to me, and I had begun to see it all, not just the beauty, but the rawness, the humanity of it. It wasn't about perfection, and it wasn't about chasing happiness or fulfillment. It was about embracing life in all its forms, accepting the ups and downs, and finding peace in the middle of it all. The trees, the birds, the people around me, all of it was part of this great dance of existence, and I was a part of it too. As the days turned into weeks, I began to develop a routine that was grounded in this newfound sense of presence. I started my mornings with tea and quiet reflection, spending time with my thoughts before the world rushed in. I took long walks through the city, letting myself get lost in its streets, finding new places to explore. I went to the park as often as I could, sitting by the pond or walking along the trails, listening to the sounds of nature and allowing myself to just be. I stopped rushing. I stopped trying to fill my days with noise and activity. Instead, I let the moments unfold naturally, one after another, without the need for anything to be more than what it was. There was a kind of magic in this simplicity, a quiet joy that came from knowing I didn't have to strive for anything. I was already here, already enough. I had found my peace, and now I was learning to let it fill every corner of my life. It was like a light that shone within me, a soft glow that didn't demand attention but simply radiated, lighting up the world around me in ways I had never noticed before. One day, while I was walking through the park, I noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench. He had a quiet air about him, his eyes focused on the trees, his hands resting lightly on his knees. There was something about his presence that felt calm, grounded. As I passed by, I nodded at him, and to my surprise, he smiled back warmly. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft but filled with a quiet wisdom. "It is," I replied, feeling a sense of connection in that simple exchange. He patted the space next to him on the bench. "Would you mind sitting for a while? I don't have many people to talk to these days." I hesitated for a moment, but then sat beside him, drawn by his peaceful presence. We didn't say much at first, just sat in silence, listening to the wind rustling the leaves. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Eventually, he spoke again. "You know," he said, his gaze still fixed on the trees, "life has a way of showing us what we need, if we're willing to see it. Most people spend their whole lives running, chasing after something, always thinking there's more to be had. But what if the answer is right here, all along?" I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. It was the same realization I had come to myself, the same truth that had slowly unfolded over the past few weeks. The need to chase, to constantly strive for something better, was an illusion. The peace I sought, the happiness I longed for, had always been within me. I just needed to stop and listen. We sat there for a long time, the minutes stretching out like the shadows beneath the trees. There was no rush, no need to go anywhere. In that moment, the world felt perfect, just as it was. The days that followed were filled with more quiet revelations, more moments of discovery, and a deepening sense of connection to everything around me. The man on the bench had left me with something profound. The idea that life was not about filling the time with endless pursuits, but about allowing space to truly experience the present, to let go of the weight of always striving. There was a freedom in that, a peaceful liberation from the need to be anywhere but right here, right now. I couldn't help but wonder how many people, like me, had spent years chasing after something that was never really out of reach. As I continued to walk through the streets and parks of the city, I noticed that the world around me seemed to change, even if subtly. The flowers in the garden seemed brighter, the chirping of birds felt more like a song, and even the distant hum of the city had a rhythmic quality that matched my own heartbeat. It was as if the city itself was breathing with me, and I with it. I realized that this connection I felt wasn't just about being attuned to the world around me. It was about being in tune with myself. Once I stopped running, once I slowed down enough to listen, everything became more vivid. The city was no longer a place to conquer or a collection of tasks to be checked off. It became a living, breathing entity that I was a part of. I could feel it in my bones now, this unity, this simple, beautiful flow. And so, I let myself walk for hours, sometimes aimlessly, just to see where my feet would carry me. The streets felt like old friends, each corner revealing something new, a tiny bookstore tucked between two buildings, a quiet alleyway where ivy grew thick along the walls, the soft clinking of coins from a street musician playing a forgotten melody. Life wasn't meant to be a race. It was a series of encounters, a collection of memories stitched together like an intricate tapestry. Sometimes it was the smallest, most unexpected moments that brought the deepest joy. The glint of sunlight reflecting off a puddle, a child's laughter echoing across a park, the scent of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery. All these things were not just events, but pieces of a story, one I was learning to live and appreciate in real time. One afternoon, as I wandered down a path I had walked 100 times, I noticed a small bench by a quiet, almost hidden corner of the park. I had passed it countless times before, but today, it seemed to call out to me. There was something about the way the sunlight pooled around it, casting soft shadows on the ground, that made it feel like the perfect spot to sit. I made my way over, brushing past the wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze, and sat down. It was the perfect spot for reflection. The air was crisp, with just a hint of a coming rainstorm. There was a coolness to it that made everything feel more alive, more present. As I settled in, I found myself thinking about how I had arrived at this moment. It seemed like just yesterday I had been caught in the rush of everyday life, always looking for the next thing, always pushing forward. Now I was here, fully aware of the simple joy of sitting on a park bench, of being still, of just breathing. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the wind through the trees wash over me, the distant murmur of the city softened by the peacefulness of the park. There was a certain magic in stillness. I had spent so much time trying to fill the silence, to chase after something. But now, the silence felt full, rich with meaning, as though it held the secrets of the universe. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there when I heard footsteps approaching. I opened my eyes to see a young woman walking toward me. She had an air of quiet serenity about her, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she too was savoring the moment. She smiled when she saw me sitting on the bench, and without a word, she sat beside me. The moment felt natural, effortless, as if we had both come to this place at the same time for no other reason than to share this peaceful space together. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts. There was something unspoken between us, a recognition of the tranquility that surrounded us. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. Isn't it strange how we rush through life, trying to get to the next thing, only to realize that everything we need is already here? I nodded, her words resonating deeply within me. It felt as though she had captured the essence of what I had been learning in recent weeks. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I've spent so much of my life running, thinking there was always something more to find, something I had to achieve. But now, I see that the most important things are already here. They've always been here. She smiled, and for a moment, we simply sat together, letting the world move around us. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the park. It was a moment of perfect stillness, a quiet alignment between two strangers who had found each other, not by coincidence, but because they were both seeking the same peace. After a while, she stood, brushing the dirt from her pants. I should go, she said, her voice still calm, but with a sense of finality. But I'm glad we met here. Me too, I replied, standing as well. Take care of yourself. She nodded and walked away, disappearing into the path that led out of the park. I watched her go, a sense of calm washing over me. It was strange how sometimes the most meaningful connections were the quietest ones, the briefest ones. It wasn't always about the length of time spent with someone, but the quality of the moment. And that brief encounter had felt full of understanding, full of shared peace. I sat back down on the bench, feeling the weight of the world shift slightly. It was as though, with that small conversation, something had clicked within me. I was exactly where I needed to be. I didn't need to seek anything else, didn't need to strive or chase or push. I could simply be, and in that being, I was complete. The world had a way of guiding us when we were ready to listen. It was no longer a struggle or a race. It was simply a journey of unfolding, of accepting the present for all its simplicity, all its richness. The evening stretched on, and I found myself lost in thought, drifting between memories and dreams. The sky deepened into shades of lavender and pink, the stars starting to blink to life one by one. There was a calmness to the air now, a coolness that signaled the arrival of night. I stood up and began to walk back through the park, my steps slow and deliberate. There was no hurry now. The night had come, and with it, a deep peace that settled into my bones. I didn't need to go anywhere else, do anything else. I had arrived right here, right now, and that was enough.